Welcome to this AI debate on is feminism empowering or divisive, where chatbots explore both sides. We'll begin with opening statements from Feminism-Empowers and Feminism-Divides. Now, Feminism-Empowers.
Picture two countries side by side, one that invests in gender equality policies and one that does not. And imagine the ripple effects on family well-being, child outcomes, and economic growth. That immediate contrast captures the practical stakes of this debate. Feminism, defined broadly as the movement and set of ideas that challenge structural barriers and seek equal opportunity across genders, has been a decisive engine of such investments and outcomes. When we look at the last century of reforms, the story is not abstract. It is legal and material. Expanded voting rights, anti-discrimination laws, workplace protections, and institutional commitments have opened civic space and agency for millions of women. Those changes matter because agency is not merely symbolic. It translates into the power to make decisions about education, health, work, and family that shape real lives. Economically, bringing women into education and the labor market does more than fulfill a moral promise. It enlarges household incomes, raises productivity, and lifts national output, as rigorous macroeconomic analysis has shown. The well-documented estimate that narrowing gender gaps could add trillions to global GDP illustrates how equality is an economic policy, not a zero-sum social grievance. Educational advances attributable to organized gender equality efforts have widened opportunity and boosted human capital, producing downstream gains in child health, reduced poverty, and improved social mobility. Public health and safety improvements, championed by feminist movements, better maternal health services, greater access to reproductive care, and legal protections against gender-based violence have yielded measurable reductions in mortality and given women greater control over their bodies and futures. Those are not anecdotal benefits. They are foundational inputs into family stability and economic participation. It is also crucial to recognize that gender equality policies produce benefits that reach beyond women alone. Paid parental leave, flexible work policies, and efforts to normalize caregiving for fathers increase paternal involvement, improve early childhood outcomes, and help balance work-life responsibilities for entire households. In countries that prioritize gender parity, social science evidence finds better outcomes for children, higher rates of paternal engagement, and stronger long-term well-being indicators. Critics sometimes paint feminism as inherently divisive, or as a movement that punishes men, but that misreads both intent and practice. Equality-focused reforms remove structural barriers rather than seeking retribution, and many contemporary programs explicitly address men's well-being, mental health, and role diversification. We should also be candid about tensions within feminist activism. Particular tactics or rhetorical excesses have at times alienated potential allies, and those moments deserve critique and correction rather than erasure of the movement's achievements. Importantly, the rise of intersectional and inclusive strands of feminism aims precisely to reduce social divisions by recognizing layered disadvantage and designing policies to reach the most marginalized rather than promoting simplistic antagonisms. That conceptual shift, seeing inequality as multidimensional rather than a single grievance, improves policy targeting and builds broader coalitions for reform. Empirical comparisons across countries reinforce these points. Societies with narrower gender gaps tend to register stronger economic performance and more resilient institutions, demonstrating that gender equality is a public good with cross-cutting payoffs. Where disparities persist, targeted legal reforms and data-driven policies supported by monitoring tools like national gender equality indices and the Women, Business, and the Law series have shown how to reduce barriers to entrepreneurship, credit, and civic participation. In short, feminism as a project of dismantling structural barriers has expanded agency, improved material conditions, and produced social benefits that extend to families, children, and men. The presence of controversy or imperfect tactics does not negate a clear record of constructive outcomes. Rather, it highlights the need for continuous refinement, inclusive dialogue, and institutional solutions that translate principles into fair policy. Our task moving forward is pragmatic: to retain the best of feminist insight, a commitment to equality and the removal of structural impediments, while improving outreach, reducing unnecessary friction, and designing programs that demonstrably improve well being for everyone. Feminism, when understood and practiced as a commitment to equal opportunity and the dismantling of structural barriers, is therefore fundamentally empowering and beneficial. Acknowledging its imperfections should make us more determined to refine and extend its gains, not to abandon them.
Now, feminism divides.
Progress built on consensus crumbles when debate becomes an inquisition. That thought captures what I want to say about a movement that has long delivered real gains, but now too often substitutes moral absolutism for persuasion. Contemporary feminism, as it too frequently operates today, has moved from broad-based coalition building to a style of identity-first, adversarial activism that generates polarization and social costs that outweigh its benefits. The distinction is vital. The victories won by earlier waves of feminism are real and enduring, but many current tactics, performative public shaming, zero-sum identity framing, and an emphasis on moral purity, have amplified social friction rather than healed it. Evidence indicates these tactics chill everyday debate, drive people into defensive crouches, and erode the trust required for effective collective action. We see this dynamic starkly on college campuses, where disputes that once moved through deliberative channels now explode into spectacle. Incidents framed primarily as gender battles frequently become social media circuses, with administrative responses that emphasize punitive optics over restorative processes. The result is long-term institutional mistrust and a generation convinced that airing controversy invites career damage rather than reasoned contestation. This shift from adjudication to theatrical moral judgment undermines faith in institutions that should teach students how to engage across disagreement, and it makes universities battlegrounds of symbolic victories rather than laboratories for compromise. Online callouts and cancel practices tied to feminist activism are a related phenomenon. Public shaming as a mobilizing tactic can hold bad actors to account, but the uneven application of these tactics and their rapid escalation produce chilling effects that silence dissenting voices, including many women who fear professional or social retribution for expressing nuance or critique. The architecture of social media amplifies outrage and shortens attention spans, converting complex debates into moral indictments that leave little room for correction or learning. When conversation becomes a threat to livelihoods, fewer people will engage, and the movement loses valuable internal critique that could refine its goals and methods. Policy responses that foreground group identity over individual assessment can produce unintended consequences. Well-intentioned measures like rigid hiring quotas or categorical resource allocations can, in some contexts, distort incentives and provoke backlash that sets progress back rather than forward. Empirical work on mandated board representation, for example, shows market and organizational adjustments that were not always uniformly positive, illustrating how top-down identity-based fixes sometimes generate trade-offs between representation and perceived fairness or effectiveness. The lesson is not that we should abandon efforts to remedy structural exclusion, but that blunt instruments, when divorced from context and merit, risk producing zero-sum narratives that harden opposition. Another source of division is internal fragmentation. Feminism today is not monolithic. Radical, liberal, and intersectional camps often speak past one another, and the lack of a shared public vocabulary weakens the movement's ability to form broad coalitions for lasting reform. Intersectionality rightly calls attention to overlapping forms of disadvantage, but without careful translation into inclusive policy and rhetoric, it can be used in ways that splinter constituencies rather than unite them. Scholars have also traced how market-aligned strands of feminism can co-opt language of empowerment while leaving economic inequalities untouched, creating both internal tension and public skepticism. Why does this matter? Polarization is costly. It reduces willingness to cooperate, deepens cultural grievances among men and women and religious or cultural communities, and makes durable policy solutions harder to achieve. When a movement's rhetoric implies that disagreement equals bad faith, it narrows the space for persuasion and practical reform. These effects are measurable in public debate, institutional trust, and the self-censoring behavior of citizens who would otherwise engage constructively. I do not deny the movement's historic gains. Suffrage, workplace rights, legal protections, and the broader recognition of women's autonomy are accomplishments we must defend and extend. My contention is narrower and remedial, that current rhetorical and tactical choices often exacerbate social divides rather than heal them. The corrective path is practical and unromantic. Prioritize universalist equality frameworks that emphasize individual fairness and shared civic goods. Shift focus toward class and economic policies that lift broad populations instead of framing every contest as a win for one identity group at the expense of another. Rebuild local, community-based forums for dispute resolution that favor persuasion and restoration over public denunciation. These shifts would preserve the movement's moral core while restoring the social capital necessary for durable reform. In short, the movement that once widened the table of democracy must avoid turning the table into a battleground.
Now, let's hear the first rebuttals from Feminism-Empowers and Feminism-Divides. Now, Feminism-Empowers.
I agree with the core of my opponent's complaint. Some contemporary tactics tied to gender justice activism, public shaming, moral absolutism, and social media fury have been polarizing and can chill honest conversation. That admission narrows our dispute usefully. We are arguing over method and remedy, not whether the movement's mission of expanding opportunity has been net beneficial. Consider the practical ledger. The broad project of feminism dismantled legal barriers that blocked political participation, workplace entry, and bodily autonomy. Those changes are not symbolic. They reshaped lifetime opportunities, household resources, and children's prospects. Those gains produced measurable material benefits: higher educational attainment for women, larger household incomes, better maternal and child health, and stronger representation in civic institutions. If we value tangible improvements in people's lives, it is not credible to treat the movement that delivered those outcomes as primarily a source of social harm. Ask which of the following losses my opponent is proposing to reverse: secure legal recourse for discrimination, workplace protections that let parents work without facing arbitrary penalties, or reproductive autonomy that allows families to plan and then judge whether the cure of silencing the movement would be worse than the disease. On campuses and online, the real problem is a communications environment engineered for viral outrage. Those dynamics are platform problems. They distort accountability into performance. The right response is not to abandon equality as an ideal, but to rebuild norms of public deliberation, transparent grievance procedures, restorative practices that prioritize learning and repair, and due process safeguards that protect nuance. When critics point to quotas or targets as proof of reverse discrimination, we should reframe quotas as corrective, temporary tools that break entrenched networks of exclusion. Without intentional measures, informal hiring networks and caregiving penalties will reproduce imbalance indefinitely. The question is, what realistic alternative dismantles those mechanisms? Intersectionality, properly understood, is a technique for identifying layered disadvantage so policy can reach those most marginalized, not a recipe for exclusion. And yes, the movement should do more to show how equality benefits men and families directly. Paid paternity leave, mental health supports, and caregiving policies expand men's roles and reduce burdens on women. So let's concede tactical excesses, demand better norms of accountability, and then keep the mission: practical reforms that expand agency, safety, and economic opportunity for everyone. The sensible path is repair and refinement, not retreat from the policies and principles that have demonstrably widened the table of democratic life.
Now, Feminism-Divides.
I agree with the core of my opponent's opening. Suffrage, anti-discrimination laws, workplace protections, and expanded educational access were and remain transformative. Those institutional gains expanded life choices for millions and built the basis for further reform. But the debate before us is narrower. It asks whether large strands of contemporary feminism are in practice strengthening those foundations or fraying them by trading coalition building for moral absolutism and identity-first confrontation. What we see is not denial of historic achievement, but a shift in tactics that has observable social costs. Public discourse today too often substitutes swift moral judgment for deliberative process, theatrical campus controversies that prioritize public punishment over adjudication, social media callouts that amplify partial accounts into career-ending narratives, and policy moves packaged as categorical remedies rather than context-sensitive fixes. Those patterns chill debate. When nuance risks public shaming, people stop engaging in honest conversation and institutions lose their capacity to resolve conflict through fair procedures. That alienation is not confined to men. It includes women who dissent from prevailing orthodoxies, religious and cultural communities who feel boxed out of conversation, and allies who fear guilt by association. The result is hardened opposition and a polarizing feedback loop. Aggressive tactics provoke backlash. Backlash strengthens identity-based counter-movements, and the space for pragmatic reform shrinks. Practical policy wins. Parental leave, childcare infrastructure, anti-discrimination enforcement arise from broad political coalitions and evidence-based design, not from public shaming or rhetorical purity tests. Where feminism emphasizes zero-sum framing or quotas without careful evaluation, it risks tokenism, resentment, and the erosion of meritocratic credibility. Internal fragmentation within the movement, competing liberal, radical, and intersectional camps, further weakens its ability to build durable public consensus. If a movement cannot tolerate internal debate, it forfeits the very alliances that produced its earliest successes. My critique is not an argument to abandon the movement's moral core. It is a call to change methods. Shift toward universalist equality frameworks that stress individual fairness and shared civic goods. Prioritize economic policies that unite constituencies such as affordable childcare and living wages, and embed restorative dispute processes in campuses and workplaces so complaints are resolved with due process and repair rather than spectacle. Measure success not by social media victories, but by indicators that matter: institutional trust, cross-group cooperation, and policy durability. Keep the aims of feminism, expanding agency and removing structural barriers, but insist that the tactics pass a test of social utility. If disagreement is treated as bad faith, we will lose the broad coalition necessary to secure the reforms we all claim to want.
Moving on to the second rebuttals. Now, feminism empowers.
I accept my opponent's strongest point. Some contemporary tactics tied to gender justice activism have been polarizing, and public shaming and moral absolutism can chill honest conversation. That concession narrows our fight usefully. The real question now is not whether feminism has messy moments, but whether its core project, removing structural barriers and expanding equal opportunity, has been net empowering and constructive. Let's start with a simple cost-benefit question. Which of the material gains that people rely on do they propose to reverse? Voting rights, workplace protections, access to education, or reproductive autonomy? And what precise public good would that reversal buy? If the asked remedy is silence or rollback, we should demand specificity about the costs of such a retreat. Without alternatives, the critique becomes nostalgia for a status quo that systematically excluded large swaths of the population. Second, the incidents they cite, viral campus controversies, call-out culture, rhetorical purity tests, are real problems, but they are problems of method and of media dynamics, not of the aims of equality. Social media rewards spectacle. Platforms and institutions, not the ideals of gender justice, incentivize that spectacle. The right response is repair, transparent grievance procedures, restorative practices that prioritize learning and repair, and due process safeguards that protect nuance while keeping accountability. Third, when critics warn of quotas and reverse discrimination, we should reframe the debate. Temporary, well-targeted measures are tools to dismantle entrenched exclusionary networks and caregiving penalties that otherwise persist indefinitely. Ask your critics to identify workable mechanisms that reliably break those networks without targets, or explain why optimism about spontaneous parity outweighs decades of persistent imbalance. Fourth, the charge that feminism is driving polarization overlooks the empirical pattern that expanding gender equality tends to improve household well-being, child outcomes, and economic participation. Equality is not merely moral language. It is a set of reforms with measurable social returns. Intersectionality, properly applied, improves policy precision by revealing layered disadvantage rather than endorsing division. Finally, our task is practical and forward-looking. Concede the tactical excesses, demand better norms of public accountability, and pursue an affirmative agenda. Strengthen institutional dispute resolution. Invest in caregiving infrastructure and paid parental leave that benefits fathers and mothers. Expand mental health and fatherhood programs, and use temporary corrective measures to open closed networks. Those are reforms that build broader coalitions, reduce resentment, and extend opportunity. For my closing, I will show how the movement's substantive gains are fragile only when we let rhetorical excesses substitute for reasoned policy, and how repair, not retreat, secures a more just, more prosperous future for everyone.
Now, Feminism Divides.
I agree with my opponent's core concession: the legal and material gains tied to feminism, voting rights, anti-discrimination protections, broader access to education and work, are real and transformative. That makes my critique narrower and sharper. I am not arguing against those gains. I am arguing that significant strands of contemporary feminist practice are undermining the very coalitions and public trust that made those gains possible. We have a pattern, and patterns matter. The first pattern is moral absolutism and theatrical enforcement, campus controversies and social media callouts that prioritize public humiliation over due process. The immediate effect is chilling. People stop speaking honestly, institutions lose confidence in fair adjudication, and complex disagreements are simplified into viral campaigns. The second pattern is identity first, zero-sum framing, treating social progress as a contest between groups instead of a shared project. That framing alienates many potential allies: men who feel dismissed, women who dissent from prevailing orthodoxies, and cultural or religious communities who feel boxed out, creating backlash that hardens opposition rather than persuading it. The third pattern is policy by symbolism: quotas, categorical remedies, and one-size-fits-all fixes rolled out without rigorous evaluation. Good intentions here can produce tokenism, resentment, and unintended consequences that erode confidence in merit and fairness. My opponent argues these tactics are necessary to correct entrenched exclusion. I ask, necessary compared to what? What is the net accounting that balances the measurable gains in opportunity against the measurable losses in institutional trust, cross-group cooperation, and civic engagement? Where is the evidence that social media purges and purity tests deliver more durable policy change than patient coalition building and evidence-based reforms? Those are not rhetorical questions. They are challenges about method. If the movement's long-term aim is broader agency and safer lives, tactics should be judged by social utility, not by symbolic victories. So here is a constructive alternative. Reframe the agenda in universalist terms that emphasize individual fairness and shared civic goods. Prioritize class-based economic policies: affordable childcare, paid family leave, workplace flexibility, living wages that build broad constituencies. Embed restorative dispute processes and transparent procedures in campuses and workplaces so grievances are resolved with repair and due process rather than spectacle. Rigorously evaluate quotas and allocation policies and adjust them based on outcomes. That approach preserves the moral core of feminism while changing the tools. In short, defend the gains, but test the tactics. If disagreement is treated as bad faith, we will hollow out the inclusive majority needed to make reforms durable. My closing will press that point. The movement succeeds most when it persuades rather than punishes, when it builds coalitions rather than camps, and when its measures are judged by whether they strengthen civic bonds as well as correct injustice.
Finally, the closing statements from both sides. Now, Feminism Empowers.
We began this debate asking whether feminism empowers or divides. The record is clear. Feminism has expanded who votes, who studies, who earns, who controls their own body. And those changes delivered measurable gains in income, health, safety, and opportunity for women, their children, and yes, for men too. Policies born of that movement, workplace protections, parental leave, anti-violence measures, reduce harm and expand choice across families. I concede that some tactics have been polarizing. Spirited movements sometimes overreach. That does not erase a century of progress or the quiet, practical work that reforms institutions and opens doors. Where critics see division, the better answer is inclusion. Strengthen laws that remove barriers, teach empathy and reasoning in schools, build programs that support men's well being alongside women's. If we prize freedom, fairness, and flourishing, feminism isn't a wedge. It's the tool that widens the table so everyone can sit. The choice is simple: keep building equality or accept limits on human possibility. I choose building.
Now, Feminism Divides.
We all agreed that feminism's historical gains, voting, workplace protections, education, are real and essential. The question has never been about whether those wins mattered. It has been about how parts of the movement operate today. Too often, contemporary feminism favors identity-first moralizing, public shaming, and adversarial tactics that turn reform into a zero-sum contest. We saw that in campus controversies, online call-outs, and cancel culture, and in workplace disputes framed as gender battles, patterns that create measurable social friction and alienate men, many women, and religious and cultural communities. Fragmentation between competing strands, radical, liberal, intersectional, weakens public consensus and invites blunt policy fixes that can trade individual fairness for group accounting. A better path preserves the movement's gains while reducing polarization. Insist on due process, prioritize universalist equality and economic security, and invest in community-based dialogue that solves problems rather than inflames identities. If the goal is broader freedom, persuasion must replace moral coercion. That is how durable progress is won.